Jessica paced around her living room, gripping her phone as she spoke in hushed tones to her best friend, Karen. The late afternoon sun streamed through the blinds, casting slanted shadows across the hardwood floor. "I've been thinking about this for weeks," Jessica murmured, steadying her voice despite the nervous energy buzzing inside her. "Tonight's the night. When Dave gets home, I'll have his favorite steak on the table, a cold beer waiting, and then, I'm just gonna say it." On the other end, Karen let out a low, knowing chuckle. "Now that's what I'm talking about. Jess, you're finally stepping up, taking control. This is your life. Why should you settle?" Jessica exhaled, a slow smile creeping onto her lips. "Exactly. I mean, Dave's a good guy, but let's be real. This whole routine we've got, it's boring. It's safe. And I need more. Life's too short." Karen's voice softened, but her tone carried the weight of experience. "I get it. When I brought this up to Mike last year, it was a disaster at first." Jessica leaned against the kitchen counter. "What happened?" Karen scoffed. "Oh, he freaked. Told me I was crazy, like he actually had a choice in the matter." She let the words hang for a moment before adding, "So I gave him an ultimatum. Either we both get what we want, or we get a divorce." Jessica's heart skipped. "You actually said that?" "Damn right I did," Karen said, completely unfazed. "Jess, we're not stuck in the 50s anymore. We're not playing by outdated rules. Men think they call the shots, but they don't. Not anymore." Jessica bit her lip, nodding to herself. "You're right. I'm not saying I don't love Dave. I do, but I want more freedom. I want to live life my way." "Exactly," Karen encouraged. "Look at Will and Jada. The media tears them apart, but guess what? They're still together. Because she stood her ground. She lived her truth. And Will? He adapted. They made it work their way." Jessica let out a breath, her confidence growing. "Yeah, I always respected that. People judge open relationships, but honestly, it's because they're stuck in old-school thinking." "That's the truth," Karen agreed. "People like us, we're rewriting the rules. We're not asking for permission. We're taking what we want." Jessica felt a thrill rush through her. "Tonight. I'm doing this tonight. I'll pour him a drink. We'll talk like adults, and I'll lay it all out for him." Karen's voice dipped lower, turning serious. "Be firm, Jess. He's gonna get upset. He'll argue. Maybe even yell. But you stay calm. Let him have his little tantrum. When it's over, he'll realize this is happening, whether he likes it or not." Jessica hesitated. "And if he says no?" Karen didn't miss a beat. "Then you do what I did. You make it clear. Your happiness isn't up for negotiation." Jessica swallowed. "And Mike? He really just accepted it?" Karen chuckled, smug. "Oh, honey." He got in line. Jessica stretched out on the couch, phone still pressed to her ear, processing Karen's words. "So I just have to stand my ground. No backing down." "Exactly," Karen affirmed. "This isn't a request. It's a decision." Jessica nodded to herself, gripping the phone tighter. "Right. If he really loves me, he'll let me do this." Karen's voice turned almost reassuring. "Trust me. He loves you too much to walk away. He'll be mad. Sure. But in the end, he'll adjust. They always do." Jessica exhaled sharply, nerves tingling in her fingertips. "All right. Tonight. I'm doing this." Karen's voice carried a quiet confidence. "Good girl. Just remember, once he realizes this isn't temporary, it'll all fall into place." Jessica sat up straighter. "Wait, what do you mean, not temporary?" There was a pause. Then, Karen's voice came back, smooth as silk. "Oh, Jess, you didn't think this was just about a little fun, did you? Remember, Jess, you deserve happiness on your terms." Jessica exhaled slowly, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Thanks for being in my corner, Karen. I really appreciate it." "Always," Karen assured her. "And if you ever need another pep talk, just call me." "I will," Jessica promised. "Good. You've got this, girl. Talk soon." "Talk soon," Jessica echoed. They exchanged cheerful goodbyes before the call ended, leaving Jessica in silence. She tapped her phone against her palm, staring at the table where she had carefully laid out Dave's favorite meal. The beer sat perfectly chilled, just the way he liked it. The weight of what was coming settled deep in her chest. Tonight, everything would change. Dave's perspective. When I walked through the front door that Saturday night, exhausted from another long shift, the first thing that hit me wasn't the usual silence. It was the rich, unmistakable scent of slow-roasted beef and buttery mashed potatoes. My favorite. I frowned slightly. Not that Jessica wasn't a good cook. She was. But a full spread, plus a cold beer waiting? That wasn't dinner. That was a setup. I stepped into the dining room, and there she was, standing by the table with that warm, practiced smile. "Hey, you," she greeted sweetly, pressing a kiss to my cheek as she handed me the beer. I blinked. A home-cooked feast and extra affection? I wasn't buying it. My gut told me something was off. We sat down, and for a few minutes, everything felt normal. I took a slow sip of my beer, letting the crisp, bitter taste settle, but the unease in my stomach didn't fade. I watched her as she picked at the edge of her napkin, eyes darting toward me, then away. "Darling," she started, her voice carrying that tone, the one people use when they're about to drop a bomb. "We need to talk." I set my fork down and leaned back slightly. "All right," I said carefully. "Go ahead." She took a deep breath, pressing her lips together, bracing herself. "I know this might be difficult for you to accept at first, but it's something I need to do." I narrowed my eyes. "Okay, so what do you need?" I kept my voice calm, steady. "If it's that important to you, of course I'll do whatever I can for your happiness." A flicker of relief crossed her face. She leaned forward, like she was about to tell me something exciting, something she'd been waiting to say for a long time. "Good. So, we've been talking about starting a family," she said slowly. My chest tightened. I nodded, waiting. "And I am ready for that," she continued. But then there was a pause. That single word, "but," hung unspoken in the air, slicing through the warmth of the room like ice water. I forced myself to keep my expression neutral. "But," I prompted. Jessica exhaled sharply. "But there are a couple of things I feel I need to do first." A prickle of unease ran down my spine. "Like what?" "It's just a few months. That's all," she rushed out. "Then we can start trying for kids." I leaned forward, watching her closely now. "That's great, baby. So, what do you need to do?" She hesitated, her fingers fidgeting in her lap. Finally, she met my gaze. "I need to sow my last few wild oats," she said carefully, like she was testing the words before committing to them. I blinked. Once. Twice. "Wild oats." I repeated, as if saying it myself would make it make sense. She nodded quickly, offering a fragile smile. "It's just temporary," she assured me. "Then I'll be able to completely settle down and be the best wife and mother you could possibly dream of." A slow, sinking feeling settled in my gut. My beer bottle felt heavy in my hand. "And?" I asked, knowing there was more. She sucked in a sharp breath, as if she were standing on the edge of a cliff, about to jump. "I'm going to be dating a few other men for a while," she said all in one breath. My grip tightened around the bottle. "We'll still be intimate, of course," she continued quickly, "but I'll also be exploring with other men, just to get everything out of my system. It's only sex, Dave. You're the one who has my love." My jaw tensed, but I forced myself to stay composed. I stared at her for a long moment, my mind working through the layers of what she had just said. "Then," she added, softer now, like she was trying to convince me, "after a couple of months, I'll come back to you, and I'll be your loyal wife again. Then we'll start our family, just like we planned." The words hung between us like a bomb with a ticking timer. I lifted my beer and took a long, slow drink, letting the cold liquid dull the burn in my chest. Then, setting it down with a faint clink, I met her gaze. "It sounds like you're not asking for my permission," I said evenly. My voice was eerily calm, despite the storm raging inside me. "So, I'm assuming you've already made up your mind." Jessica opened her mouth, maybe to reassure me, to soften the blow, but I lifted a hand, stopping her. "Don't," I said quietly. She hesitated, guilt flickering in her eyes. I leaned forward, my voice dropping lower. I'm not going to remind you that you're married or that you stood in a church and vowed forsaking all others, because clearly, that means nothing to you right now. And I'm not going to waste my breath trying to stop you. Her face flushed, her fingers twisting together in her lap. I continued, my tone steady but sharp. Since you went through all this trouble, cooking my favorite dinner, handing me a beer, it's obvious you've been planning this conversation for a while. And let's be honest, Jess. I tilted my head slightly, reading her expression. You probably already have someone lined up, don't you? Her lips parted, maybe to deny it, but I caught the flicker of guilt. That was all I needed. A slow, humorless smile spread across my face. So let me make this crystal clear. I leaned forward slightly. Officially, as your husband, I am declining your proposal to open our marriage. Jessica's expression shifted, shock mixing with uncertainty. She hadn't expected that, and she sure as hell wasn't ready for what I was going to say next. I exhaled slowly, gripping the beer bottle a little tighter. I am not going to stand by, I said, my voice firm, and I sure as hell am not giving you permission to sleep with other men. The words tasted like acid on my tongue, bitter before they even left my mouth, but I needed to keep control of myself, at least for now. Since you've clearly made up your mind, I continued, my voice deadly calm. I need to know the logistics. Are you planning on moving out? Or were you expecting me to leave? Jessica's lips curled into a small, almost hopeful smile. Oh no, she said lightly. I figured we'd both keep living here. After all, we're still married. I stared at her. She actually thought this was reasonable. And like I told you, she went on, you and I will still be making love. She emphasized those last two words as if that would somehow make it more palatable. They will just be, sex. I raised an eyebrow but kept my mouth shut. I imagine I'll go to their place sometimes, she added, voice casual, like we were talking about a weekend trip to the lake. But I'll probably bring them back here, too. My grip on the beer bottle tightened. Back here? She nodded, as if she were explaining something completely normal. Well, I mean, it just makes sense. Why pay for a hotel when we have the space? On those nights, you'd just sleep in the spare room. I leaned back in my chair, forcing myself to stay still, to not react. But inside, my blood boiled. I inhaled sharply, making sure my voice was steady. Let me be very clear, I said, my tone cold and deliberate. As long as I am in this house, you will not bring another man into it. If you do, I let the words settle, let her feel them. You and that man will both get seriously hurt. Her smile faltered. For the first time, there was uncertainty in her expression, but I didn't care. And another thing, I said, my voice laced with disgust. Since my wife apparently wants to screw half the town, let's get something straight. I won't be touching you. Not while you're doing this. Jessica's expression softened, like she was trying to look understanding. Well, Dave, she said, almost regretfully, that's disappointing. I love you, you know. I always enjoy our lovemaking. But, she sighed dramatically. I guess I'll have to live with it. My jaw clenched. She guessed she'd have to live with it? I crossed my arms, my eyes never leaving hers. So, I said flatly, when do you plan on starting your little flings? A flicker of excitement returned to her face, and that twisted my stomach worse than anything else. Well, she said, her voice bright, Karen and I made plans to go out to a club tomorrow night. We're meeting up with a couple of guys from work. Not sure what'll happen, but I might bring one of them back here for the night. My jaw tightened. She kept going, unfazed by the tension in the room. And since you're not going to be with me while I'm doing this, maybe it would be best if you just moved into the spare room, at least for the next couple of months. I stood up slowly. Don't worry about it, I said coldly. I'll make sure I'm moved out by the time you get home tomorrow night. This was going better than I ever could have hoped. I leaned back in my chair, a slow smile playing on my lips. He didn't yell. He didn't throw a fit. He sat there, calm, rational, treating the whole thing like a normal conversation. My heart swelled with happiness. Sure, he had a few complaints. He was refusing to have sex with me, for now, but that was only temporary. Linda was right. Dave would accept this. He'd come around, and in 2 months, he'd be exactly where I wanted him, under my control. His refusal was just a front, a weak attempt at holding on to old-fashioned thinking. But I knew men, and I definitely knew Dave. Give it a week or two, he'd be back in my bed, and when he came crawling back, I'd dangle it like a carrot, just enough to keep him in line. Later that afternoon, I called Linda. "Hey, Karen, it's Jess." "Tell me," Karen said immediately, a smirk in her voice. "How did it go? Did he lose it?" I let out a dramatic sigh, sinking into the couch. "You won't believe it," I said, rolling my eyes, even though I was alone. "It was so easy. He didn't yell. He didn't even seem angry." Karen let out a low laugh. "Oh, Dave. Always the gentleman, even when he should be flipping out. You're lucky, Jess. Most guys would have thrown a full-blown tantrum." I smiled. Right? I was sure he'd snap, but he just sat there. We talked about it. I was honest with him, and yeah, he wasn't thrilled, but he wasn't upset either. "I think he's still trying to process it all." Karen hummed in approval. "That's good. That means he's thinking it through. Maybe not ready now, but eventually, he'll adjust." "Exactly," I said, nodding. I told him I don't expect him to just fall in line right away. He needs time to figure it out, and I want him to do this on his own terms, not because I'm forcing him. "Smart," Karen said approvingly. "Men need to think they're in control, even when they're not." I grinned. "Exactly. And he did say something interesting." "Oh." "He told me he won't be sleeping with me while I'm with other guys," I said, rolling my eyes. I don't know if that was a challenge, or if he's actually serious. But either way, I'm not pushing him on it. Karen chuckled. "Oh, Jess, he thinks he means that. But trust me." I smirked. "Give it time," she continued. "They always come back." I leaned back, stretching my arms over my head, my smile growing. Yeah, he'd be back. He'd always been predictable. And once he realized his place, he'd stay there. If he wants to take a step back, I'm not going to argue. Karen's voice softened. That's a tough one. But honestly, Jess, it might just be his way of holding on to some control. He feels powerless. The more time he has to sit with it, the more likely he is to come around. Yeah, that makes sense. He's vulnerable right now. Everything changed overnight. I can't expect him to just accept it immediately." Karen paused for a moment before chuckling. "You know what's funny? Give him a week or two of sleeping alone, knowing you're right there in the next room. He'll be back in your bed before he even realizes it." A laugh slipped from my lips. She wasn't wrong. Maybe. He's always been a creature of habit. Once reality sets in, he might find it harder to resist than he thinks. We laughed together. "Meet me at the club at 7, Karen said, and we hung up. A thrill ran through me as I set my phone down. The way this was unfolding gave me a sense of power I hadn't expected. Jim refusing to touch me? Fine. He thought he could dictate boundaries, but I wasn't playing by his rules. From the hallway, I heard him shifting boxes, drawers opening and closing as he packed up the last of his things. The sounds didn't bother me. In fact, they reassured me. We were moving into something new. "Jim." He didn't answer right away. When I stepped into the hallway, he was sealing the final box, his back turned. There was something surreal about seeing him like that. Like we had already become two separate people, sharing space but disconnected. I didn't feel sadness. Not really. More like a strange detachment. The house already felt different, and maybe that was a good thing. By the front door, I adjusted the straps of my dress, smoothing it down, admiring the way it fit. I hadn't worn it in over a year, but it still hugged my body perfectly. Something about putting it on tonight felt freeing. A reminder that I was stepping into something better. "All right, Jim, I'm heading out," I said lightly, throwing it out there as if it was just another night. "I'll probably be back around 1, so don't wait up for me." He didn't look up, just finished taping the last box. "Don't worry, sweetheart," he said, his voice calm. "I'll be moved out by then." A slow smirk tugged at my lips. That was exactly what I wanted to hear. "Good," I said, nodding before turning toward the door. "Take care of yourself, Jim." "Goodbye, Jessica." Something about the way he said it made me pause for half a second, but I ignored it. I stepped outside, closing the door quietly behind me. As I walked down the driveway, A wave of freedom washed over me. I wasn't just leaving the house. I was leaving behind a life I had outgrown. The music pulsed, the bass vibrating through the floor of the club. Karen leaned in, her eyes gleaming under the neon lights. So, Jim really moved into the spare bedroom? I swirled my drink lazily before taking a sip. Yep. He promised he'd be out by the time I got back. Brian, one of the guys from work, raised an eyebrow. That's what he said? I smirked. I will be moved out by then. Word for word. They laughed. Logan grinned, leaning in. Damn. I was hoping we could just make the little cuck move over and do it right next to him. I rolled my eyes, chuckling. Maybe after I work on him for a week or two. Then I turned to Brian and Logan, a teasing glint in my eye. But first, why haven't either of you asked me to dance yet? Brian smirked and stood up. Logan followed. I let them lead me to the dance floor, the music swallowing us whole. The rush of bodies, the thrill of knowing exactly where the night was going. It was intoxicating. Brian's hands on my waist. Logan's voice in my ear. The promise of something new, something exciting. By the time I got home, Brian was right beside me. The house was dark. Jim was already gone. I led Brian down the hall, my fingertips trailing along the wall as I walked. When I opened the bedroom door, I half expected to see Jim's things still there. Some forgotten piece of his old life. A reminder. But there was nothing. He had followed through. A satisfied smile played at my lips. He had accepted it. Maybe I'd cook him breakfast tomorrow. A little thank you for being so cooperative. But tonight? Tonight wasn't about him. The truck sat parked 2 streets over, engine off, hidden in the shadows. Jim sat in the driver's seat, eyes fixed on the bedroom window. His fingers tapped against the wheel, slow and deliberate. His face was unreadable. In the back seat, his bags were packed, but not for just anywhere. His phone buzzed on the console. One message. Unknown number. You were right. She planned the whole thing. Let's talk. Jim exhaled, staring at the screen. Then, without hesitation, he put the truck in drive and pulled away. Not looking back. Not yet. Brian and I had wild sex, and once we were done, he rolled out of bed, stretching like a man who had no worries in the world. He checked his phone, muttering something about needing to get back to his wife and kids. I barely acknowledged it. I wasn't interested in the details of his personal life. I had my own to deal with. After he left, I slipped on my robe and wandered into the kitchen, already craving my usual morning coffee. But when I reached the counter, a frown tugged at my lips. No coffee. No breakfast. It was after 10. By now, Dave should have had everything ready. He knew my routine. He knew how late I'd been out. The least he could do was make sure I had something waiting for me. I sighed, irritation creeping in. So much for cooking him a thank you meal. If he thought he could slack off now that he was in the spare bedroom, he had another thing coming. I settled for a plain bagel, chewing as I moved through the house, the silence pressing in around me. No Dave, no coffee, no breakfast. This was not how things were supposed to go. After a quick shower, I threw on an old pair of shorts and a t-shirt. Just as I was tying my hair into a ponytail, my phone rang. Hey, you, I answered, recognizing Karen's name on the screen. So, she said, her tone teasing, how was Brian? A slow smile spread across my face. Everything I expected. And how did Dave react this morning? I rolled my eyes, pacing the kitchen. That's the thing. I don't know. He's still in bed, and honestly, I'm a little annoyed. I was hoping he'd be up, making my coffee and breakfast. I was even thinking about rewarding him for moving to the spare room, but not anymore. Karen chuckled. Yeah, let him know you're disappointed. Make it very clear what you expect moving forward. And don't forget to throw him a bone now and then. Small rewards keep them in line. Her words settled into me, fueling my growing frustration. In fact, I said, already marching toward his room, I'm going to handle this right now. The spare bedroom door swung open, and I stopped in my tracks. The room was empty. His clothes gone. His tools gone. The closet, once filled with his things, was bare. It hit me like a punch to the gut. Dave didn't just move to the spare room. He moved out. Oh, hell, I muttered, my pulse kicking up. What's wrong? Karen's voice crackled through the phone, the amusement in her tone vanishing. Dave's not here. My voice was tight, my breathing sharp. His stuff isn't here either. Hold on, I said, shoving the phone between my shoulder and ear as I rushed through the house. My footsteps were heavy, my chest tightening with each empty room I checked. The living room, nothing. The kitchen, nothing. Then I reached the window. His truck, gone. I stood there, staring at the empty driveway, the realization creeping over me like a slow-moving shadow. Dave wasn't sulking in the spare room. He hadn't slept in. He hadn't been too lazy to make coffee. He was gone. I pressed the phone back to my ear. Shit. His truck's gone. His tools are gone too. A small, nagging voice whispered in the back of my mind. That flicker of doubt I'd ignored last night. He never said he was moving to the spare room. He said he was moving his stuff out of my room. I thought he meant just the room, but he meant the house. And he meant it. Karen's voice remained steady, even as mine wavered. Listen to me. You do not call him. You do not give him that power. You let him come back to you. I gritted my teeth. But, Jess, this is good. This is leverage. A slow, tight breath left my lips as I tried to let that sink in. He's throwing a little tantrum right now, she continued smoothly. That's all this is. Give it a couple of days, and he'll be begging to return. I pressed my fingers against my temple, pacing. Are you sure? Karen chuckled, low and knowing. Of course I'm sure. Look at my husband. I run my house. You just have to hold firm. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I wanted to believe her. Dave was dependable. He was loyal. He had been mine for so long. He wouldn't just walk away. He was probably angry, trying to prove something to himself. But after a few nights alone, he'd come back. Karen was right. I let out a slow breath. You've been right about everything so far. There was still that small, unsettled part of me, the one that felt off balance. Because as much as I wanted to act like this was a power move, I couldn't ignore the sting of it. I did love Dave. He wasn't just some pawn in a game. And the idea of him truly leaving, of not coming back, that unsettled me. But maybe this was how things had to be. An open marriage could be the answer. The perfect balance. Dave for security, for stability, for home, and other men for everything else. Eventually, I could settle back into my life with Dave. But why should I rush? I deserved more. Karen made it sound so easy. And maybe, if I followed her lead, I could have it all. I pressed my lips together, my mind settling. I needed to stay cool. Dave would come back. And if he didn't, then I'd make him want to. The thought sent a slow smirk curling at the corner of my lips. For now, I needed a distraction. Tomorrow, Brian and I had another session at work. The thought of his confidence, his energy, it was exactly what I needed to take my mind off things. I made myself a simple dinner, nothing fancy. And for the first time all day, I let myself smile. Dave was playing a game. He just didn't realize. I was going to win. I poured myself a glass of wine, letting the rich, velvety taste roll over my tongue, easing the tightness in my shoulders. For the first time all day, I allowed myself to just breathe, to sit in the quiet and enjoy the evening without thinking about anything else. The house was silent, and for a moment, I told myself that was a good thing. After finishing my drink, I cleaned up the kitchen, flicking off the lights before heading to bed. The sheets were cool against my skin, but sleep didn't come easily. My mind wouldn't shut off. What if Dave doesn't come back? What if this is really it? I sighed, turning over, forcing those thoughts away. Tomorrow was another day. 2 days passed, and I still hadn't heard a word from him. I kept telling myself it wasn't unexpected. Karen had reassured me that he'd reach out soon, that the longer he stayed away, the more I'd be able to control the situation when he came crawling back. That thought brought me a twisted sense of comfort. Maybe Dave just needed time to come to his senses. Or maybe he was testing me. Either way, Karen was certain it wasn't anything to worry about. In the meantime, I kept myself busy. After work, I met up with Logan, Brian, and a couple of other guys. They were charming, confident, and fun. They made me forget, at least for a few hours, about the nagging unease creeping up my spine. That night, I took them home. It was wild. For hours, I lost myself in the heat of their bodies, the thrill of something new. But once the night faded, once they were gone and I was left alone again, that creeping thought returned. Dave was still missing. By the third day, the silence was starting to feel heavy. By the fifth day, everything collapsed. It was mid-morning, and we were gathered around the coffee maker, chatting lightly during our break. Karen laughed at something Brian had said, the conversation easy, normal. Then we noticed her. A woman approached, late 20s, polished, professional. She was put together in a way that made her stand out, deliberate, precise. She stopped in front of us, her expression unreadable. Jessica Parker, Karen Morgan, Brian Powers, and Logan Smith? Her southern drawl was soft but sharp, cutting through the conversation. We nodded, confused. Without another word, she reached into her bag and handed each of us an envelope. I opened my mouth to ask what it was when she suddenly lifted a small digital camera and snapped a picture of us. Quick, clinical, like she was documenting something for evidence. Then she smiled. "Y'all have been served." And just like that, she turned on her heel and walked toward our boss's office without a single glance back. I stared at the envelope in my hands. What the hell? I muttered, my pulse kicking up. I called after her, hoping for some kind of explanation. She didn't stop, didn't acknowledge me. She simply walked into the office, opened the door without knocking, and disappeared inside. Less than a minute later, she emerged, still smiling as if she hadn't just detonated a bomb in the middle of my life. "Y'all have a nice day now," she chirped, her voice cheerful. Then she was gone. For a moment, we just stood there, the four of us frozen in place. Then, almost at the same time, we tore open our envelopes. My heart stopped. Petition for the dissolution of marriage. I felt like the air had been punched out of my lungs. My hands trembled slightly as I flipped through the pages. The words blurred together, my mind struggling to catch up with what I was looking at. Then I saw it. Adultery. The cause listed. The reason. My stomach dropped. Before I could process anything, Brian and Logan's phones rang at the same time. They both pulled them out, their faces immediately shifting, color draining from their skin. "Oh, hell," Brian muttered under his breath. Logan just stared at his screen, his mouth slightly open, frozen in place. It didn't take long to piece together what had happened. I could guess exactly what was on their phones. Their wives knew. They had received the evidence. And now, everything in their lives was about to be turned upside down. Brian let out a sharp breath, gripping his phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. What the hell is happening? Logan didn't answer, didn't move. He just kept staring at his screen in stunned silence. One moment, everything was normal. The next, our worlds had just been ripped apart. Then a bellow erupted from the boss's office. "What the hell?" I jumped, my pulse spiking. A moment later, the door slammed open, and our boss stormed out, his face red with fury, his eyes locked on us. His voice thundered across the office, sending a chill straight through me. "You four, get in here. Now." I didn't move. I couldn't move. This wasn't just bad. This was catastrophic. We didn't need to exchange words. There was no time for that. Heads down, we shuffled toward his office, the weight of impending doom settling over us. I could feel the heat of his glare as I passed, his fury radiating off him like an open flame. The second the doors slammed shut behind us, my stomach twisted into knots. Bad didn't even begin to cover it. His voice hit like a hammer. "Well, can any of you brainless morons at least confirm that none of this shit happened on company time or company property?" Silence. I swallowed hard, gripping my arms tightly as my pulse pounded in my ears. "Apparently," he continued, his voice dripping with rage, "the company is being sued for failing to enforce the moral code outlined in our employee handbook. Any idea why someone might want to do that?" Again, silence. His glare was searing. "No one? Fine. Let me spell it out for you then." He slammed a folder onto his desk, flipping it open. "We're being sued because apparently Mrs. Jessica Parker can't seem to keep her legs closed. Mr. Smith and Mr. Powers can't keep their zippers up, and Mrs. Karen Morgan has taken it upon herself to act as the madam of the goddamn brothel." I felt my entire body go numb. Now, Would any of you like to assure me that these claims are unfounded? The room was suffocating. Not a single one of us dared to speak. His face turned an even darker shade of red. You better start praying this doesn't all come crashing down, because if it does, you all can kiss your careers goodbye. The meeting ended in a suffocating silence. We walked out of the office like ghosts. No one spoke. No one looked at each other. It was like we had all simultaneously realized how royally screwed we were. I walked straight past my desk, my fingers gripping my phone like a lifeline. I had spent days convincing myself that I was in control, that I held the power, that Dave would crawl back the second he realized I was the one running the show. But now, all I had was silence. This wasn't fun. This wasn't power. This was a disaster. My heart pounded as I scrolled through my contacts, desperately searching for a name. Someone, anyone, who might know where Dave was. Each call was the same. Cold. Empty. No one had heard from him. No one knew where he was. I gritted my teeth, gripping my phone so tightly my fingers ached. God damn it. I muttered under my breath. I tried his closest friends. The guys he'd spent years camping with, playing poker with, grabbing beers with after work. If anyone knew where he was, it would be them. But nothing. Not a single lead. Not even a hint of where he'd gone. The knot in my stomach tightened. What if he was done with me? What if this was his way of saying he was finished? I ran my fingers through my hair, trying to keep myself from spiraling. Jessica, calm down, I whispered. But my own voice sounded hollow. I closed my eyes, inhaling deeply, trying to regain some sense of control. This wasn't me. I wasn't the one who panicked. I was the one who called the shots. How had things escalated so quickly? Just days ago, I was the one making the rules, planning how Dave would eventually cave and come back. Now, I was the one frantically searching, hoping to find him before it was too late. I stared at my phone again, scanning through the list of names. There had to be someone who had spoken to him, someone who had a clue where he went. But there was nothing. And for the first time, I realized I had pushed too hard. I had assumed too much. And now I was paying the price. The man I had once promised forever to, the man I had convinced myself would never leave, was gone. And he wasn't even taking my calls. It twisted something inside me, a sharp, gut-wrenching ache I wasn't prepared for. I wasn't angry anymore. I was desperate. The tables had turned, but not the way I had imagined. Dave wasn't the one who would be begging and groveling. I was. I had miscalculated everything, and now I was the one scrambling to fix it. I clenched my jaw, staring blankly at the office lobby, the weight of my own choices pressing down on me like a crushing force. I had no plan, no strategy. I was just lost. Monday morning, I walked into Dave's office building, my heart hammering as I approached the front desk. The receptionist barely glanced up at me. "Hi, I'm looking for Dave Parker," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. She barely even looked up. "He's on leave." I blinked. "What?" "2 weeks." She tapped at her keyboard lazily. "Won't be back until then." A hollow, sickening feeling spread through my chest. I wanted to scream. I wanted to demand answers. But instead, I just stood there, frozen, paralyzed. I turned and walked out, my legs shaky, my mind a whirlwind. Back at my own office, my boss's glare burned into me as I walked past his door. I was late. I knew I was late, but I didn't even care. I couldn't pretend to care. Dave was gone. I couldn't reach him. His friends had all turned their backs on me. And for the first time, I had to face the terrifying reality that maybe, just maybe, Dave was never coming back. Even if I wanted to show up at his doorstep, I had no idea where he was anymore. The thought of standing there, knocking, hoping for some kind of response, it was humiliating. It was desperate. And yet, I was willing to do it. Everything had spiraled so far out of control that I was willing to throw my pride aside just to see him again, just to have something make sense. But then Karen's news came. At first, I couldn't believe it. Karen, always so confident, always in control, was homeless. Mark had served her with divorce papers. But that wasn't even the worst part. The way it happened? It was brutal. Apparently, he'd found out about her affairs and snapped. He wasn't the weak, submissive husband she had always painted him to be. No, Mark wasn't going to take it. When he found out, he didn't hesitate. He kicked her out, literally, threw her things onto the front lawn, changed the locks, and left her standing there with nowhere to go. I didn't know what to feel. Relief? That it wasn't me? Guilt? That I had followed her lead? Or fear? That my fate was going to be just as harsh? Karen had lied to me. She had sold me on this idea that we were the ones in control, that we had all the power. But the truth? We never had it. And then, somehow, it got even worse. The boss called me into his office, his expression grim, his tone almost bored, as if he had dealt with situations like this 100 times before. "Jessica, you and Karen are under investigation." He said it like he was reading off a routine report. "The men have been fired," he continued, "but you two, well, you're different." I didn't need him to explain. I knew what he meant. We weren't being treated the same. But in that moment, none of it mattered. What mattered was how far I had fallen. I never thought it would come to this. But then, the evidence. It was all laid out. Every video, every image, every shred of proof, displayed for everyone to see. I sat there, completely exposed, unable to even look at myself on the screen. There was no defense, no justification, no way to spin this into something it wasn't. I had nothing. It was over. 3 months later, the divorce was final. I wasn't expecting much. There was nothing to split, no alimony, no joint accounts. The house was leased, so I didn't even have that to deal with. But still, the emptiness of it all crushed me. I cried for days. Not the kind of tears you can hold back. Not the kind that stop when you get tired. No, these were the kind of tears that made it feel like you'd never stop. The kind that washed over everything I thought I knew. And eventually, I had to go back to work. I couldn't avoid it forever. But the second I stepped through the doors, I was called into my boss's office. I didn't know what to expect, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened next. When I walked in, he was sitting behind his desk, that damn smirk on his face. The kind of smirk that made my skin crawl. He handed me an envelope, watching me, waiting. I already knew. I didn't even need to open it. My walking papers. I had been fired. Maybe it was inevitable. After everything that had gone down, the scandal, the humiliation, the legal mess, maybe I should have seen it coming. But somehow, it still felt like a punch to the gut. And the way he smiled as he handed it to me, like he was enjoying it, like he won, that made it so much worse. I stared at him, my fingers tightening around the envelope. He didn't say much. Didn't need to. He just sat there, waiting for me to react. But I didn't give him the satisfaction. I walked out. 2 days later, I learned the truth. It was Dave. It had always been Dave. Apparently, he had made a deal with the company. He worked out an agreement, one that kept me employed just long enough for the divorce to be finalized. Because if they had fired me before that, he would have been on the hook for paying me something. But now, he didn't owe me a damn thing. I sat there, stunned, my mind racing. Dave had been playing his own game all along, and he won. I had nothing. No job, no husband, no lover. Brian and Logan, the men I thought I could count on, were drowning in their own divorces, barely able to keep themselves afloat. Karen? She was fired alongside me, left to fend for herself with nowhere to go. And all of it, the chaos, the destruction, the mess, it all came down to one thing. We had been pawns. Every single one of us. We thought we were in control. We thought we had the power. But the truth? The real truth? The men, the ones we underestimated, the ones we assumed would just take it, they had set the rules from the start. And now? They had taken everything. It wasn't justice. It wasn't even closure. It was revenge. Cold, calculated, and absolute. And we were the ones left standing in the wreckage, trying to pick up the pieces. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel. See you soon.